kings of the late Bronze Age looked at their ledgers and saw a world that was, for the first time in human history, truly invincible. They had woven a web of trade that stretched from the tin mines of Cornwall in Britain all the way to the lapis lazuli pits of Afghanistan, creating a global economy so tightly knit that a merchant in Mycenaean Greece could drink from a vessel made of Egyptian clay while wearing a sword forged from Cypriot copper. They believed their connectivity was their armor, a shield against the chaos of the past, but they couldn't see that the very complexity they built was actually a fuse. By the year 1200 BC, the system was so efficient at concentrating wealth that it had forgotten how to survive a single bad day. Do you ever wonder if our own unbreakable global networks are just as brittle as theirs were? If you were to stand on a hill in Anatolia, that's the massive peninsula we now call Turkey, around 200 years ago, you would be standing in the heart of the Hittite Empire. To your west, across the Aegean Sea, you'd find Mycenaean Greece, a collection of fortress palaces where every scrap of grain and every jar of oil was recorded by bureaucrats on clay tablets. To your south lay Canaan, a region covering what we now know as Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, which functioned back then as a wealthy province of the Egyptian Empire. Further east, you had Mesopotamia, the land between rivers in modern-day Iraq, where the Assyrians and Babylonians were constantly jockeying for power. It was a world of giants, all of them speaking to one another, trading with one another, and most importantly, needing the same thing to survive: bronze. In our world, we talk about oil as the lifeblood of the economy, but in 1200 BC, the lifeblood was bronze. Bronze is what we call an alloy, a metal made by mixing two others together, copper and tin. It was the strongest material anyone had ever seen, the high-tech of the era, used for everything from the armor that protected a king to the plow that tilled a field. But nature played a cruel joke on these early civilizations because copper and tin are almost never found in the same place. Copper was mostly found in Cyprus. The island's name actually comes from the word for copper and parts of Anatolia. Tin, however, was rare. You had to go to the edges of the known world to find it, places like Britain, Iberia, which is modern Spain, or the mountains of Afghanistan. To make a single sword, a king in Greece had to ensure that trade routes thousands of miles long remained open, safe, and profitable. This meant that the entire world was interconnected in a way that feels eerily modern. If a war broke out in the mountains of the east, a blacksmith in the west ran out of materials. If a plague hit the Nile, the price of tin in Anatolia skyrocketed. This was a proto-capitalistic system, a world where the pursuit of resources drove innovation and expansion. But as the system grew, it began to change the people at the top. Have you noticed how wealth, once it reaches a certain level, stops being a tool for growth and starts becoming a game of control? The lecture series suggests that this is the natural trajectory of capital. In the beginning, a leader is someone who organizes, someone who opens trade routes and protects the people. But over time, the leaders of these different empires, Egypt, the Hittites, the Assyrians, began to act less like protectors and more like a cartel. They aligned with one another to exploit the populations beneath them, focusing entirely on how much money they could extract from the system. They stopped looking at their subjects as people to be led and started seeing them as commodities to be exploited. This brings us to a concept that explains why societies that seem to be at their peak suddenly fall off a cliff: elite overproduction. This is a theory championed by a scholar named Peter Turchin, and it's a bit of an uncomfortable mirror for us to look into. The idea is that in any successful society, the number of rich and powerful people, the elites, tends to grow over time. As the society gets wealthier, more families move into the upper class, and more children are born into those families expecting a life of luxury and a seat at the table of power. But the number of seats at that table, the high-level government jobs, the top military commands, the roles that actually carry power, doesn't grow nearly as fast as the number of people who want them. What happens when you have 100 people who think they deserve to be the CEO, but there's only one office at the top? You get a society where the elites start fighting each other for the right to charge rent. In this context, rent-seeking behavior means trying to get a cut of the existing wealth without actually doing any work to create new wealth. Think of it like a landlord who raises the price of an apartment without fixing the leaky roof, or a bureaucrat who demands a bribe just to let a merchant pass through a gate. When a society becomes dominated by rent-seeking, no one is actually producing anything of value anymore. Does it make sense that a world where everyone is trying to be a middleman is a world that has stopped building for the future? By 1200 BC, the Bronze Age civilizations were top-heavy. They had too many princes, too many priests, and too many bureaucrats, all of them demanding their share of a pie that had stopped growing. This created a massive amount of pressure on the people at the bottom, the farmers and the laborers who were actually doing the work. These people were being squeezed for every last drop of tax and labor to support an elite class that offered them less and less in return. Eventually, the people at the bottom became indifferent to the survival of the system. If your life is miserable and the people in charge are just exploiting you, why would you pick up a spear to defend them when the enemy arrives? This is where the idea of resilience comes in. A resilient society is like a sturdy house that can survive a storm. It might lose a few shingles, but the structure holds. But the Bronze Age societies had lost their resilience because of this internal rot. They were like a tower that looks magnificent from the outside, but has had its support beams eaten away by termites. The tower won't fall down on its own, but it doesn't take a hurricane to bring it down either. A simple nudge, a single bad harvest, or a small group of invaders can cause the whole thing to buckle. For a long time, historians looked for a smoking gun to explain the Bronze Age collapse. They blamed the Sea Peoples, a mysterious group of raiders who supposedly swept through the Mediterranean, burning cities to the ground. Or they blamed a massive drought that lasted for decades. Some even blamed earthquakes. But the predictive history lens suggests that it wasn't any one of these things alone. It was a perfect storm of factors hitting a system that was already fundamentally unstable because of elite overproduction and rent-seeking. When the trade routes were cut, perhaps by a small war or a localized famine, the entire globalized world felt the shock. Because they were so interconnected, they couldn't just pivot. A palace in Greece that relied on Egyptian grain and Afghan tin couldn't suddenly go back to being a self-sufficient farm. When the supply chain broke, the elites panicked. They didn't come together to solve the problem. They turned on each other, fighting for the remaining scraps of wealth. This led to civil wars, revolutions, and a total breakdown of order. Is it possible that the greatest danger to a civilization isn't the enemy at the gates, but the inability of its leaders to stop competing with each other? Historically, there are only a few ways to solve the problem of having too many elites. One is to literally kill them off in a war or a revolution. Another is to go and invade someone else's country to find new land and new roles for your excess nobility. But there's a third way, which is how many kings originally came into power: land redistribution and debt cancellation. In ancient times, a king would sometimes realize the society was about to snap and would step in to reset the clock. He would take land back from the greedy elites and give it to the peasants, or he would simply declare that all debts were forgiven. It was a radical restart button that allowed the society to keep going. But by 1200 BC, the elites were too powerful and the kings were too much a part of the cartel to hit that button. The result was a collapse so total that it's hard for us to wrap our heads around. In Greece, they didn't just lose their gold and their palaces, they lost the ability to write. The bureaucratic script they used, called Linear B, vanished. For several hundred years, the region fell into a dark age where people lived in small huts among the ruins of giant stone walls they no longer knew how to build. They looked at the massive fortifications of their ancestors and thought they must have been built by giants, the Cyclopes, because they couldn't imagine mere humans doing such things. But here is where the story takes a turn that the predictive history lens finds fascinating. Collapse is traumatic, yes. It is violent, and it destroys the lives of millions. But collapse also clears the ground. The old system was centralized, censored, and rigid. The bureaucrats in the palaces controlled what was said and what was recorded, creating a world of propaganda and narrow thought. When the palaces fell, that censorship died with them. The old, clunky way of writing, which only a few specialized scribes could understand, was eventually replaced by something much more revolutionary: the alphabet. The alphabet was a technology for the people. It was simple, easy to learn, and it allowed for the expression of complex ideas by anyone, not just a palace official. And into this new, decentralized world stepped a figure named Homer. He didn't write bureaucratic lists of how many sheep were in the king's stable. He sang about the human condition, about heroes, and about the very collapse that had happened centuries before. This new freedom of expression and the new way of communicating became the foundation for what we now call Greek civilization. If the Bronze Age hadn't collapsed, would we ever have had the philosophy, the art, or the democracy that followed? The lecture notes point out that this pattern isn't unique to Europe or the Middle East. If you look at the Maya civilization in Central America, you see a similar arc. Around 200 AD, their civilization began to explode in growth. They built massive cities, developed incredible calendars, and created a complex society. But they too fell into the trap of elite overproduction. They built more and more temples, supported more and more priests and nobles, and placed more and more pressure on the environment and the farmers. And just like the Bronze Age empires, the Maya civilization collapsed when it hit a period of instability. It wasn't just bad luck. It was the natural cycle of a society that had grown too top-heavy to stand. We like to think of history as a straight line moving upward, a story of constant progress. But the predictive history perspective sees it as a series of waves. A society grows, it becomes complex, it develops a proto-capitalistic drive for expansion, and then it inevitably creates an elite class that becomes a burden on the system. The elites stop being innovators and start being parasites. They focus on the rent, the system loses its resilience, and eventually the tower falls. No society in human history has been stable forever. The question isn't whether a collapse will happen, but what the people who live through it will build from the rubble. When we look at our own world today, the parallels are hard to ignore. We are more interconnected than the Bronze Age kings ever dreamed. Our tin and copper are rare earth minerals from the Congo and microchips from Taiwan. We have a global elite class that often seems more loyal to each other than to the people in their own countries. We see rent-seeking behavior everywhere, from the way housing markets work to the way digital platforms extract fees. We are living in a world of incredible wealth, yet many people feel that the system is no longer working for them, leading to a sense of indifference or even a desire to see the whole thing burn down. But if we take the lesson of the Bronze Age to heart, we realize that the collapse wasn't the end of the world. It was the birth of a new kind of humanity. It moved us from the era of the palace bureaucrat to the era of the poet and the philosopher. It replaced a system of total control with a system that, while chaotic, allowed for the emergence of the individual. The secret history suggests that this is simply how capital works. It builds a world, and then it destroys it to make room for the next one. It's a brutal, painful process, but it's the process that gave us the alphabet, the Iliad, and eventually the very idea of freedom. The kings of 1200 BC thought they were at the end of history, that their trade routes were the ultimate achievement of mankind. They couldn't imagine a world where their palaces were just piles of stones for shepherds to sleep in. They were blinded by their own success, unable to see that the more they squeezed their world for profit, the more they were ensuring its destruction. They didn't realize that a society's strength isn't measured by the gold in its treasury, but by the resilience of its people and the ability of its leaders to know when they have taken enough. As we navigate our own era of global connectivity and elite tension, we might want to ask ourselves which part of the cycle we are in. Are we still building the tower, or are we the ones watching the support beams being eaten away? The Bronze Age didn't end because people forgot how to make bronze. It ended because the people in charge forgot how to be leaders. They became a cartel, and in doing so, they turned their greatest strength into their fatal weakness. If we can't learn to control the growth of our own elite class and the impulse to treat everything as a commodity, are we just waiting for our own version of the sea peoples to arrive? The most haunting thought from these lectures is that collapse might be a necessary feature of human development, a forest fire that clears out the dead wood so that new life can grow. It's a terrifying prospect for those of us living in the dead wood, but it offers a strange kind of hope for the future. The Greeks who lived through the Dark Age didn't have the luxury of the Bronze Age, but they had something the palace slaves never did: a voice. They had the alphabet, they had Homer, and they had the chance to build a world that wasn't just a machine for extracting rent. So as you look at the complexities of our modern world, the fragile supply chains, the fighting among the powerful, the sense that the people at the bottom are being pushed to their limit. Remember the kings of the Bronze Age. They had everything, and they lost it because they couldn't stop wanting more. History suggests that the only way to avoid their fate is to find a way to redistribute the land and cancel the debts before the system does it for us. Is a civilization that refuses to reform itself simply choosing to be replaced? Perhaps the most important thing we can learn from the great books is that the patterns of the past aren't just stories. They are the blueprints of our own future, and we are currently living in the middle of a chapter we've seen many times before.